Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Raihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and I'm very proud to introduce our Hayek Prize ceremony. The Hayek Prize is a celebration of Friedrich Hayek, one of the most consequential thinkers of the modern era. A celebrated economist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1974, Hayek did more than just make intellectual breakthroughs. He inspired a generation of economic reformers who helped liberate countless millions from poverty around the world, and his message remains vitally important as we look to the future. Above all else, Hayek was a partisan of individual liberty, who saw economic freedom as inextricably linked to human progress, and who understood the dangers of an unlimited state that would rob ordinary people of their agency, dignity, and creative potential. I'm proud to say that Hayek played a role in the formation of the Manhattan Institute. One of our founders, Sir Anthony Fisher, a successful entrepreneur, once asked him how to reverse the erosion of freedom. Hayek urged him to invest in the battlefield of ideas, and that is exactly what we do today. We at the Manhattan Institute are dedicated to building on Hayek's legacy, and this prize is the crown jewel of these efforts. Each year, we award $50,000 to the book that best encapsulates and advances Hayek's conceptions of economic and political liberty. The Hayek Prize is one of the most generous book prizes in the world. Tonight, we will hear from the 2024 Hayek Prize winners, Senator Phil Gramm and John Early, who, together with the late Robert Ekelund, wrote The Myth of American Inequality, a groundbreaking work that rigorously and carefully demonstrates the extent to which official statistics exaggerate the extent of income inequality and understate the generosity of government transfers. Before I turn it over to my distinguished colleague John Tierney, however, there are several people I would like to thank for their support and hard work that goes into this prize. None of this work would be possible without the support and friendship of Manhattan Institute trustee Thomas W. Smith, who first conceived of the prize, and Diane Smith. Together, they have supported the prize since its inception. Please join me in thanking Mr. and Mrs. Smith for their generosity and commitment to the cause of freedom. In addition to Mr. Smith, we have a number of other Manhattan Institute trustees who have kindly joined us tonight. Ann Charters, Michael A. Kaufman, Nick O'Neill, and Russell Penoyer. Thank you for being here. I'd also like to recognize Manhattan Institute President Emeritus Larry Mohn. Larry Mohn has done an enormous amount for the cause of freedom, and we're very fortunate to have him tonight. Thank you. I'd also like to recognize the Hayek Prize jury, the distinguished women and men who carefully read each nominated book before selecting the winner. Brian Anderson, Donald J. Boudreau, Tom Easton, Catherine Mangue-Ward, James Pearson, Amity Schlase, John Taylor, and of course, John Tierney, the chairman of the Hayek Prize jury. John is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor at City Journal, and one of the nation's most renowned and respected science journalists. A best-selling author known for his keen ability to make complex ideas engaging and accessible, he is a Hayekian through and through, and a perfect steward for this important prize and its important mission. Please join me in welcoming John Tierney to the stage.
Thank you very much, Raihan, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. On behalf of the Hayek Prize jury, I can promise you a lively evening filled with surprising insights about the long-running debate about free market capitalism. Now, by now, even its critics concede that capitalism has lifted billions of people out of poverty. But we're constantly told that there's a terrible problem with it in America. Capitalism has lifted some people too far out of poverty. Now, income inequality, according to Barack Obama, is the defining issue of our time. Now, I have to confess, I don't really get this. Why should people enjoying the fruits of the richest society in human history care so much if there are some people who are richer than they are? It seems to me this is a distinctly first world problem. I think if you asked the millions of immigrants coming to the United States what they care about, their defining issue would not have anything to do with how big Jeff Bezos' bank account is. But there's no denying that inequality is a major political issue, especially this election year. Politicians keep telling us that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, middle-class wages are stagnating. President Biden complains that the rich don't pay their fair share of taxes, and 2/3 of Americans agree with him. It's taken for granted among journalists and academics that income inequality is worse in America than in Europe, and that the class disparities here have been widening for decades. But none of that is true, as we're going to hear tonight from the winners of the 2024 Hayek Prize. Their book, The Myth of American Inequality, How Government Biases Policy Debate, demolishes the conventional wisdom about income inequality. Middle-class wages, the poverty rate, and the tax burden on high-income Americans. The authors rigorously show, and they do this very clearly, that government officials, journalists, and scholars have gone wrong for decades about this. And they show this not with any arcane economic formulas or with obscure statistics, but rather by analyzing basic government data that has been selectively ignored for far too long. The three authors came to this book with a wealth of experience in academia in Washington. Phil Gramm taught economics for 12 years at Texas A&M before being elected to Congress. He represented Texas for more than 2 decades, first in the House of Representatives and then in the Senate, where he was chair of the Banking Committee, and he co-authored landmark legislation that restrained spending and lowered taxes. He's currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. The second co-author, Robert Ekelund, had a long and distinguished career as a professor of economics at Texas A&M and then Auburn University, during which he wrote more than 20 books and several hundred articles on economic theory, history, and policy. Sadly, he's no longer with us. He died last year at the age of 82. We miss him very much this evening, but we're glad that he'll be joined by his longtime partner, Mark Twain, and by his goddaughter, Madison Auld. I should mention that Dr. Thornton is himself an economist in the finest tradition of Hayek. He's a fellow at the Mises Institute and an editor at the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. Could I ask both of you to stand, please? Thank you. Thank you. The third co-author, John Early, is a mathematical economist, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and a veteran analyst of government data. He twice served as Assistant Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where he directed the design, economic analysis, and survey operations for the Consumer Price Index and for other major economic surveys. He's also the president of the consultancy Vital Few. Now, he will join us on stage for the Q&A after Senator Gramm's lecture. This year's winner was chosen from a group of superb finalists. I recommend them all. They're described in the program. And I want to recognize 2 of the finalist authors with us this evening. One is Richard Alanya, the author of The Corporation in the 20th Century. It's a magisterial history that offers a revisionist explanation for the rise and fall of the giant managerial corporations of the last century. And it demonstrates the great harm done by antitrust actions and other government policies. It's also a great read with one fascinating story after another about companies and industries. Professor, could you stand? Congratulations. The other finalist is a treat for Hayek fans by Vikas Yadav. His book, Liberalism's Last Man, Hayek in the Age of Political Capitalism, analyzes Hayek's international bestseller in the 1940s, The Road to Serfdom. The analysis combines rigorous scholarship with marvelously clear and readable prose and very timely lessons for today. Given the economic success of political capitalism in China and other countries, Yadav concludes that the classical liberals need to reconsider Hayek's ideas and rediscover the book's moral core. Professor, could you stand? Thank you for coming. Hayek dedicated The Road to Serfdom to the socialists of all parties, who in his day dominated political debate, and they too were obsessed with reducing income inequality. Hayek knew that their grand schemes would fail economically while leading to injustice and threatening individual freedom. He wasn't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, and neither are the winners of the 2024 Hayek Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Phil Gramm.
Thank you, John, very much. I want to ask my wife to stand up, Wendy Lee Graham. On behalf of my late colleague and very dear friend, Bob Ekelund, and John Early and myself, I want to thank you for honoring us in giving us the Hayek Book Award. Knowing the quality of the people who were nominated makes the award that much sweeter and more meaningful for us. I guess it's fair to say that I became skeptical of government economic data in my first life as an economist. Most of my research as an economist was basically taking government data apart, reinterpreting history, and much of that work focused on the Depression and the greenback and free silver movements. I first started to look at government statistics on poverty and income inequality when I was chairman of Commerce State Justice Appropriations in the Senate. I had been working on the American budget for 16 years, and so I knew the budget pretty well. And as I got jurisdiction over the Commerce Department, I could never reconcile the commerce data on income of the bottom 20% of American earners with the budget of the United States in looking at the amount of money that we were spending on means-tested programs. Now, for a while I thought, well, maybe it is just an index of how inefficient the government was. But just as I started to look at census data in detail, there was an opening on the Finance Committee, and so I left appropriations and left the subject, but I came back to it in 2017. In 2017, I was looking at economic data for the year, and I discovered that, well, maybe I should point out first what happens. Census puts out data on household income, which is a building block for all economic data in the United States related to poverty and income. And at almost the same time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out data on consumption, which is also broken down by quintiles. Well, in 2017, the Census Bureau 1 week says that the average income of the bottom 20% of American households is $13,000 plus. The Bureau of Labor Statistics a couple of weeks later says that the bottom 20% of American earners spent and earned and spent over, didn't earn, they had and spent over $26,000, twice as much as their income. The second quintile spent 11% more than its income, and the top quintile spent only 50% of its income, even though there was no evidence of any such thrift rates to be found anywhere in the economic data of the United States. And so it was at that point that I called my old colleague, Bob Ekelund, and said, look, Bob, we need to look at this thing. Something is profoundly wrong here. So we started looking at it, and we immediately found that going back to 1947, that in calculating household income with limited ability to do surveys and with the fact that almost all payments were in cash or cash equivalent, that the Census Bureau measured income and by counting only cash payments and cash equivalent. We found that 2/3 of all government transfers were not counted by the Census Bureau as income to the people who received the transfers. And the Census Bureau took no account of taxes, so that in measuring income, they took gross income, even though most people never see the income that they pay in taxes. This produced a situation where the Census Bureau was not counting a check you get from the Treasury as part of the poverty program and the Earned Income Tax Credit. They weren't counting food stamps where you get a debit card as income. And it's interesting because poverty is based on an estimate from the USDA about the cost of a nutritional diet. And yet the Census Bureau measured the poverty rate without counting food stamps. They didn't count Medicaid, where the government pays your total health care bill. They didn't count rent subsidies. And as we found when we started working with John Early, they didn't count 100 other programs that cost over $100 million a year at a minimum. It was while we were working on the first Wall Street Journal article that focused on the remarkable fact that it wasn't just that our numbers grossly overstated income inequality and grossly overstated poverty. It was that when you adjusted for transfer payments and taxes, the bottom 60% of Americans had basically the same income, even though only 36% of the able-bodied people in the bottom 20% of income earners actually worked. It was during this period in putting that first article for the Wall Street Journal together that we discovered the work of John Early. It was a happy day in my life, I can assure you. John knew more about the government statistics of the United States than Bob Ekelund and I could have ever learned had we spent every moment for the rest of our life studying it. In fact, I immodestly tell people in all earnestness that John Early knows the statistical system of America better than anybody else alive. And immediately, we started working together. We wrote the book, not where one person wrote one part and one person wrote another part. We analyzed, we debated, and we wrote it together. Now, what did we find? The Census Bureau says that the top 20% of earners in America have an income that is 16.7 times the average income of the bottom quintile. We show that if you count all transfer payments, and that's transfer payments net of the cost of making the transfer. If you count all transfer payments as income, and you count all taxes as income lost, that the ratio is not 16.7 to 1, but 4 to 1. Now, you can say 4 to 1 is too much, but the debate on 4 to 1 is a very different debate than a debate about 16.7 to 1. We show that if you count all transfer payments as income to the recipients, that the actual poverty rate is not 11.5%, but some 2.5%. In looking at poverty in detail, we basically are able to show, I believe, that people who are actually poor in America are people who've fallen through the cracks. They've got a physical problem, a mental problem, or a problem with alcohol or narcotics, and the program doesn't reach them. And so no matter how much you put into food stamps or earned income tax credits, they don't get those programs. So what has happened is over the years, and I witnessed it for 25 years in the belly of the beast in the Senate, is that about every 5 years we debate how rich America is, and we have these poor people that need our help, and we raise means-tested programs, and then the Census Bureau didn't count them. And then 5 years later, we had the same debate again, and we raised the programs again. From 1967, am I talking too loud, Wendy? Okay, from 1967 until 2017, prior to the pandemic, the real purchasing power value of transfer payments to the average household in the bottom 20% grew from $9,700 a year to $45,400 a year. Now, what happened during that period is that we started in 1967 with 67% of the prime work age persons in the bottom 20% of income earners actually working. By the pandemic, that number had fallen to 36%. Now, as we presented this book at Harvard and at Stanford and at the University of Chicago and all over the country, one of the arguments has been made is that the book shows how the welfare program has worked. It's eliminated poverty. But of course, our response is it's eliminated want at a price of idleness. And so how many people had God-given talents? How many people had genius that was never discovered? Because they never got on the playing field of life. They never competed. Now, you've all heard The Economist magazine's famous by saying that income inequality in America is high and rising. My friend Bernie Sanders says, income inequality in America is immoral and un-American and unsustainable. Well, this is a shocker, so get ready. We show that if you count all transfer payments, all transfer payments as income to the recipients, and all taxes as income lost to the taxpayer, that the level of inequality is actually 3% lower today than it was in 1947. Now think about this. This is a frightening prospect. We are having a serious debate about changing the American economic system to deal with a problem that does not exist, and verifiably so. Now, we look at a lot of other issues in this book, and I want to be brief. We look at what causes earned income inequality. Well, it's a bunch of things. The proclivity of highly educated professional people to marry each other is a big factor in the concentration of income in this country, because immediately about 80% of them are in the top quintile. We look at many other factors, but there are two big ones. One is, do you work or not? And the other is, how sharp are your tools? How well educated? How the quantity of education and the quality of education? We look at the fact that we have 5 consumer price indexes in America. The most accurate one we use to index the tax code. The least accurate one we use to index Social Security and welfare programs. If we just use the most accurate price index, and there's no debate about it, nobody in the country would argue that no one would argue about the fact about what the most accurate of the 5 price indices is. If we just use that for 20 years, we would cut the debt by $1 trillion. We look at rich people. Who are these people? How did they get rich? Did other people benefit from them getting rich? And then the big debate of our era, do the rich pay their fair share? Well, if 100% is your fair share, no. But we show, using IRS data, that up to the top 0.1% of filers, that the average tax rate rises to 41%. And then it levels off, and for 400 people who earn almost all their income from capital gains and who give away vast amounts of their wealth, it dips into the 30s. Now, we look at all of these things from Piketty and Say's to the ProPublica expose. And what do we find? It's very revealing. ProPublica had stolen tax returns. And they put out their expose on it, and they show that these very rich people, like Warren Buffett, pay a very low tax rate. But the IRS data doesn't show that. So how did this happen? Well, what they did apparently is they took, well, we know what they did partly, but we don't know if the income figure they report is from the tax return, but apparently it is. But they don't use taxable income from the tax return. They make up an income figure based on an estimate of what your income would be if you sold every asset you own every year and paid capital gains tax on it. Now, in Piketty Say's, they do two baits and switch, not one. They count no transfer payments. So almost 90% of the income of the bottom 20% of income earners in America comes from transfer payments. So you lower their income by 90%, and then you don't take taxes into account, which raises the income of upper income people by 41%. But then they do the game of saying, what is your real income? Well, it's as if you sold your house, cashed out your retirement, sold all your assets, and paid capital gains on it every year. This is the data you're reading in the paper every day, which nobody goes behind. Who are rich people? They're people who make other people rich. Now, I know Bill Gates is very rich, but he's created hundreds of thousands of jobs. His products have enriched our lives. How exactly am I poorer because Bill Gates is richer? And Warren Buffett, God bless him, he is a poster child for the left. One of the arguments against Warren Buffett is he pays himself a low income so that he doesn't have to pay taxes. And this raises the Ebenezer Scrooge question. You remember Fred, Ebenezer's nephew, says that Ebenezer's wealth does him no good because he doesn't spend it. Well, if it doesn't do him any good, who does it do good? Well, people like Ebenezer Scrooge funded the Industrial Revolution that changed our lives, that set the world off on economic growth that's never ended. Warren Buffett has made us all richer with his efficiency as the greatest investor in history. He's taken many people in the companies he owns and runs to the top of the mountain. How anybody could be envious of him, and he's never bought a new car. My baby son is here, and I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, and my son knows the great investor, and so he sent me a nasty email saying, "Pop, you need to pay attention to what you're writing because Warren Buffett has a brand new Cadillac." So I thought, damn, I thought I had this right. So I sent Buffett an email apologizing. He sent me the registration form for his Cadillac. He has never bought a new car in his life. Listen to your father. That's the lesson. Is the American dream alive and well? Well, this is a subject very close to my heart. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. And so if somebody's going to convince me that the system is rigged, they're going to get up mighty early in the morning. Never in my life has anybody ever told me that there was anything that I could not do or could not be because of who my daddy was. It's who I am. It's what I've done. That's what works in America. One of the things I love about Texas is Texas is the only place in the world where you play down your ancestors. I remember once I was with Baby Bush, and he was just beginning to get interested in politics, and we were a bunch of people. He was talking, and hell, in listening to him, you would think he was from the backwoods of nowhere. So finally I said, "George, your father's president of the United States." But that's why Texas is so great. So, is the American dream alive and well? Yes. We show that 93% of the people who are born and grow up in the bottom quintile end up making, or as adults, living in households that have more income than their parents. We show that in comparing what happens to people that are born and grow up in the 5 different quintiles, that of the people that are born in the bottom quintile, 2/3 of them as adults aren't enough to break out of the bottom quintile. And that's not counting, that's comparing their income as adults to the income levels of people in their era, another generation than their parents, a period where the income of the country grew by almost 50%. So that when you compare their income to their parents based on what incomes were in real purchasing power when they were children, 28% of them rise to the top quintile, which of course is now only the middle quintile, $115,000. So the American dream is alive and well. I like to tell the story that George Washington's grandmother came to America as an indentured worker. Washington became the richest man in colonial America and president, and in the words of King George III, the greatest man in the world. That was America then, it's America now. And this is important. I've got a quote from Hayek. I don't want to screw it up. Hayek said, "Past experience is the foundation on which our beliefs about the desirability of different policy and different policies and institutions are based." We need to get our facts straight. Plato said, a man's only as good as his facts. And our book is about getting those facts, and that's why it's important. And we're very honored to be here, and we look forward to answering. I look forward to early answering a hard question. I'll answer the easy questions. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go up here. All right.
Thank you very much for that great lecture and for the great book. The first question that comes to mind is, have you shown these numbers to Bernie Sanders?
Well, you know, I was on a plane with Bernie, and he was in first class, of course. And I said to him, you know, just trying to be friendly, you know, Bernie, I didn't agree with you on many things, but I always admired the fact you weren't a phony, that you really believe it. And so, you know, I thought it was a nice thing to say to him. He said, well, let me tell you, I never agreed with anything you did, and I was proud to fight it then, and I would do it now.
So he's impervious to these facts then?
Yeah, but the good thing is he believes it. Mm-hmm. And there's so many that don't. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of sincerity is my test of a politician. Mm-hmm. That I vote against a lot of sincere ones, but.
Now, it seems amazing when you talk about all these obvious things that were left out, the taxes that rich people pay, the payments that the low-income people get. I mean, I can guess the answer to this, but I just want to hear the view from two people in Washington. I mean, why has this been ignored for so long? I mean, why did it take until 2017 for anyone to point this out?
Well, I would say inertia is maybe the foundation. Mm-hmm. And then once some people started looking at what changing the traditional way of doing it might do, they would have undoubtedly had some resistance to proposals to change. Mm-hmm. Getting changes made in the statistical system are very hard unless they're supporting a policy purpose. Mm-hmm. And we saw some of that with the so-called supplemental poverty measure, which is another story we could go into, mm-hmm. but it's a little off track. Where, in fact, there was a change made in order to support the call for additional refundable tax credits. So inertia is the first thing. Mm. And the difficulty then of making change compounds that. Mm-hmm. For these particular things, there really has been virtually no debate about it. It's not like there was a debate and it came up for vote in a Congress or in a committee and was turned down. It just doesn't get talked about. Mm-hmm. And that's what we are hoping to build a bit of a fire to do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me respond. I think it's debated because the government wants more money and they want to raise taxes on high-income people, same reason Willie Sutton wanted to rob banks, because that's where the money is. But there are 2 points I'd like to make. One is, we show in the book that if you took every penny of income from every billionaire that we don't already take in taxes, that you couldn't fund the government, federal, state, and local combined in 2020 for a week. So that this whole debate about super rich people is irrelevant in terms of the nation's problems. Secondly, I didn't point out that the OECD, until it became an agency to try to raise international taxes, used to do a study about every 10 years of tax rates and looking at what the top 10% of earners, how much of the income of the country they earn compared to how much of the taxes of the country they pay. And the last full-blown one, we had far and away the most progressive tax system in the world, meaning that while the top 10% in America did on average earned more, they paid proportionately even more in taxes. The last study, and John discovered this, the last study they never put out, and they've stopped doing the study. Well, there has not been a change in the tax code since the Reagan tax cuts, and this applies to the Reagan tax cuts as well, that didn't make the tax system more progressive. If you read the book, we show that one of the reasons for the decline in inequality is that the tax system has become significantly more progressive over the last 50 years.
Yeah, I would add on the OECD, although they stopped doing that study, there's other data that you can pull out that shows exactly the same thing. In the United States, the highest income group pays 35% more of their proportion of the taxes they pay is 35% greater than their proportion of their income. That is the highest of any in the world. France, for example, it's between 1% and 2%, because they have what? A VAT.
In Sweden, it's even. In other words, they pay the same percentage of their income. The percentage of income the top 10% earn is the same as the share of the taxes they pay. So if anybody makes an argument that the rich don't pay their fair share, the rich people in America pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than any other people on the face of the earth. And that's documentable.
Now, what about, you mentioned about income mobility. What about the narrative that the middle class wages have stagnated in the United States, the standard of living has stagnated?
Well, that one gets down to a problem of the way in which it's adjusted for inflation, in part. There's some other issues in there.
Yeah, 28% of compensation now is fringe benefits, and they're not counting that.
That's the other thing. It doesn't count fringe benefits, which have grown as a proportion. And then they use the price index, the consumer price index for all urban consumers, which is one of the ones that Phil was referencing earlier, is not the best way to deflate. It overstates inflation, therefore it makes it appear as though income has risen less than it really has. And there's another official BLS statistic called the change CPIU, which measures it much more accurately. And if you would use that, that stagnation would go away.
Well, just a simple figure you can remember. As compared to 1967, in real purchasing power dollars, 2/3 of all Americans today are in the top quintile. It's a remarkable figure. I mean, people don't stop and think. The gal that I really work for, but technically she works for me, was saying to me when putting this book together, well, look, if everybody's so prosperous, and I believe that, why is it so hard to make ends meet? And so I said to her, well, I think what happens is these ends keep getting further and further out there. And I said to her, for example, she just bought a house. So I said to her, how does your house compare to the first house that your family lived in? And her answer, my house is nicer than any house that my parents ever lived in or live in today. So yeah, it's hard to make ends meet.
We can take questions from the audience now.
Please talk loud, because I'm old and people have yelled at me and I don't hear.
So I have a question. My question is about the percentage. So, because the Europeans, and I don't know, because again, thank you. So, kind of your wonderful lecture and book reminds me of the expression, there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. So you guys seem to have the real numbers. So my question would be as a percentage of GDP, based on numbers that I've looked at, the U.S. definitely spends less on government, for example, than our European friends or Japanese friends. But based on what you guys are saying, the rich pay their taxes. And, the government, we have this obscene kind of federal deficit in the, tens of trillions of dollars. So who's not paying? Or rather, how do we have this crazy deficit? And sort of if the rich are paying and, kind of the government as a whole is not spending as much, it seems to me, as, for example, the government. For example, in France, I think it's 50% of GDP, north of 50% of GDP is the government. In America, I think it's in the 30s. It depends on what you count or not count. So is the government...
I think the answer is simple. Let me give you the street answer and let John give you the technical answer. But basically, we have a smaller government, thank God. And as a result, government takes less of GDP in the United States than in most developed countries. But as a share of paying for that government, compared to the share of income they earn, rich people pay more in America.
So there's less to pay, but the rich pay more.
That's right.
But also the middle class pays more in Europe, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the middle class pays substantially more in Europe. The big difference between, say, France and Germany on one hand, the U.S. on the other, is if you add the two together, the top 10% in France pay, I think the number in the book is 108% compared to the 100% of their income. In other words, the progressivity of their tax code is 8%. The progressivity of our tax code is what?
35%.
35%. So what basically we're saying is that they pay more taxes in France than we pay, but as a share, the bottom 90% pay substantially more everywhere else than they pay in America. In fact, the bottom 50% of Americans, if you take out state and local taxes, pay a very small share of income taxes. We have let the system become more and more progressive. And I can remember once we took people off the tax roll in the Reagan tax cut. And I can remember Reagan saying at a private discussion, does it make any of y'all nervous that we're going to have more people that aren't paying taxes? And it was a price we paid to pass the bill, but it sure as hell should have made us nervous. It is frightening. In a tax debate, most people that are stating opinions in public polls aren't paying taxes. So it's easy to think that we ought to raise them if you're not paying them.
I want to commend you on a very readable and meticulously documented book, and I'm sure you know those things don't always go together. The most astounding thing to me was that the income of the middle quintile is essentially the same as that of the bottom quintile. It's just that the sources of the income are from work versus from transfer payments. And I wonder what your thoughts are about the sustainability of that in a political sense in a very heterogeneous country where there may not, be the sense that I should be working 40 hours a week to pick up the tab for someone who is working 20 or 10.
I would think that part of what you're seeing is what's become labeled as populism. I'm not sure that that's the right label for it. But, in any case, the response that people are giving that's one of the things that's driving it. There are a lot of other things driving it as well. But, simply saying, I work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and the difference between my income and someone down at the bottom end of the scale the income difference may be 20-some%. And that's all the difference is for my working full time, and they're not working at all. And that's showing up, I think, in some of the attitudes that we're seeing.
Yeah,
but I couldn't prove it.
Yeah, if you talk to working people, and we live out in the country, and so we always have something broken. We always got people coming to fix it. And I've never heard one of them talk about resentment about rich people. Their resentment is to people that are, in their words, sitting on their ass, not breaking a sweat, and they're as well off as I am. And I think that's the economic roots of much of the populism we're experiencing today. Now, another part of it is, of course, this assault on traditional values, which just drives people crazy, and Hispanics just go berserk. But I think that's it. One of the points we make in the book is that welfare benefits are now so large that the incentives to work, if you don't have any significant skills, is almost zero. The fact that 36% of them work is astonishing. And we had such good experience with the welfare reform under Clinton, where we reformed a little piece of welfare, AFDC, that we need a full-blown work requirement for means-tested programs. And as we look at the debt and the deficit and our ability to not go broke and our ability to pay for defense, the elephant in the room is not Social Security. Social Security, in its whole history, on average, has reduced demand for general revenues because it's had a surplus most of the period. Medicare is partially paid for by premiums. The elephant in the room that nobody's paying attention to is means-tested welfare programs. And they're huge. And if we don't reform them, you're not going to deal with the problem. And the point is, we can make America better off reforming them, and we can make the people that are getting the benefits better off reforming them. Now, we don't make the politicians who depend on their votes better off, but they're the only real losers, I see it.
So I was really intrigued by your discussion of how inequality has changed over time in terms of income and consumption, and also how poverty has changed over time. In terms of people doing prior work on these topics, it seems to me there's a lot of overlap in findings and methodology with the work of Bruce Meyer at the University of Chicago. So I'm just curious exactly how your work differs from theirs.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, we actually have incorporated some of the work that they have done into our work. Their approach was different, but we got the same answer. Their approach was they took poor families in their base year, which I think was 80. I think it was a little earlier than that. But anyway, it was 1980, give or take a couple of years. And they said, what are they consuming? How much food? How much do they pay for their shelter? And so on. And then they said, okay, we're going to call this our base poor family, and for each of the different sizes of families. And they said, okay, if that's true, if that was poverty in 1980, give or take a year or two, how much would it take to have that same level of consumption today?
In real terms.
In real terms, to have the same amount of food, the same size of house, the same type of clothing. And they come up with about, I think it was 2.8%, whereas we came up with 2.5%. So they took the approach of a different way of measuring it, and what we did is we keep the old way of measuring it, but get the right data in there, don't have the missing data, but we come up with the same answer, essentially, which means that there's got to be a horse in there somewhere.
Yeah, our two studies basically verify each other.
So you're using administrative data on income, transfers, and income after taxes and transfers. You're getting administrative data on that as opposed to relying on current population surveys of how much people are receiving in transfer benefits.
Well, on transfers, we use what is in the surveys to help us distribute it. But yes, we use administrative data on how much food stamps, for example, there is. Well, there is, in fact, some food stamp data in the surveys that's not used. Well, we used what's there and made it up, and we gross it up to what the administrative, how many billions of dollars were paid in rent subsidies. Well, there's some data in the surveys about rent subsidies as who gets them, but we then took that data to set how much then is missing. And about 2/3 of the total is missing, and nearly 90% of it's missing for the poor families.
One more question we have time for.
All right. My question was about if there's any good way to measure the underground economy. So
Pull the mic closer to you.
can you hear me now? Okay. So for if the bottom quintile of people are receiving these transfer payments, they have an incentive to earn their income outside of taxable income. They're earning it under the table. Do you factor that in or discuss that in any way? And also, I wanted to talk about the more of a recent phenomenon, maybe, but the illegal immigrant problem, where these people aren't probably taxpayers, but they are probably counted on a population census. How do you account for those people?
Well, in the book, we mention the fact that we don't have a good measure of unreported income. And there's a tremendous amount of unreported income, both in all illegal activities and in much of the legal work that is done on an independent contractor basis. If you live in the country and you have somebody come in and do something, they want to be paid in cash. That they're not reporting that income. So we believe there's a substantial amount of unreported income, but we have no way of measuring it. And when you're writing a book about getting your facts straight, you have to be very careful about not making up stuff.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture and for the answers. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for coming, and thank Tom and Diane Smith for supporting this great prize. Good evening.